There are many famous mysteries from the Middle Ages that have kept us guessing, such as the fate of King Edward II and the princes in the tower, or the meaning of the Voynich Manuscript. The Middle Ages are often referred to as the Dark Ages because the lack of information means we know less about it than other historical periods. Historians struggle to know how or why medieval events occurred, and that lack of information is the perfect ingredient to cook up a conspiracy theory and allow our imaginations to run wild. The Middle Ages was also a harsh, difficult time, a time when death appeared everywhere with never-ending wars, religious persecution, crusades, and a pandemic that probably wiped out as many as 50 million people worldwide, perhaps 50% of the European population. In Europe, the church influenced everything, and when events occurred, the people often exaggerated them to give them a mystical or divine purpose. Some medieval mysteries may never be solved because material has been lost over time or an archaeological site has been destroyed. The lack of answers only makes these mysteries all the more intriguing. Today we thought we would take you on a journey back to the Middle Ages to discover some more puzzles that have stumped the curious for centuries. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The Lost Book. It was the most extraordinary text, supposedly one of the most important travelogues that we have never seen. But what was contained in the Inventio Fortunata? It is said to be written in the 14th century by a Franciscan friar from Oxford, England. In the 1360s, the friar in question made around half a dozen journeys to the North Atlantic region on behalf of King Edward III. On his first journey, he travelled north and described what he found there. He went into the Arctic Circle beyond Iceland and Greenland, and may have even made it as far as Markland on the Canadian coast. Unfortunately, by the time that explorers sought out the work in the 1940s, the Inventio had gone missing. So how do we know that the book even ever existed? Well, it is mentioned in other writings. It was summarized in a second text, the Itinerarium, written by a Brabantian traveller from Den Bosch, now in modern-day Holland. His summary was the basis for the Arctic regions in many maps. Sadly, the Itinerarium also went missing, but not before the map maker Gerald Mercator copied some of the work into a letter and sent it to John Dee, the English magician and courtier to Queen Elizabeth I. Dee lost the letter, but had copied parts of it into his notebook. That was also almost lost when it suffered fire damage. The notes are a confusing mix of Latin, English, and Dutch, and it's hard to know what the substance of the original text was, and the Inventio Fortunata remains one of the most mysterious of lost medieval books. In 1956, a letter was found in a Spanish archive from the English merchant John Day to the most magnificent and most worthy lord, the Lord Grand Admiral, who we can assume to be Christopher Columbus. The letter, dated either December 1497 or January 1498, reads in part, quote, "Your lordship's servant brought me your letter. I do not find the book Inventio Fortunata, and I am very sorry not to find it, because I wanted very much to serve you. I am sending the other book of Marco Polo and a copy of The Land, which has been found by John Cabot." Which leads us neatly to our next mystery. What happened to John Cabot? Cabot was born in Genoa, Italy around 1450. Having read about the voyages of Marco Polo and the fabulous Chinese cities described in his writing, Cabot decided to see them for himself by travelling west across the Atlantic. Like Columbus, Cabot found it difficult to find sponsors for his expedition, and having failed on mainland Europe, he took his family to England to try his luck. After Columbus had made his successful voyages to the Americas when he was sure he had reached the Far East in 1496, Cabot was given the backing of King Henry VII for, quote, "free authority, faculty, and power to sail to all parts, regions, and coast of the eastern, western, and northern sea, under our banners, flags, and ensigns, with 5 ships or vessels, and with so many and with such mariners and men as they may wish to take with them in the said ships, to discover and investigate whatsoever islands, countries, regions, or provinces of heathens and infidels, in whatsoever part of the world placed, which before this time were unknown to all Christians." Everyone believed that there were spices, silks, gold, and jewels in Cathay and Kapangu, China and Japan, and that it would make England one of the greatest trading centres in the world for goods from the east if Asia was where Cabot thought it was. The Matthew sailed from Bristol in 1497 with a crew of 18. They found land after a month and claimed it in the name of Henry Tudor. It was actually one of the northern capes of Newfoundland, although Cabot was rewarded with the sum of £10 for finding a new island off the coast of China. In 1498, Cabot was sent by Henry to travel even further west in the hope of discovering Japan. This time, there were 5 ships with 300 men. What happened to John Cabot after this is still unknown, although one of his crew is recorded as living in London in 1501. Did Cabot die at sea? Did he settle in North America? Or did he return after a successful voyage and die in England, as one historian believes? Cabot's son, Sebastian, also became an explorer. In 1528, he sailed from South America to Spain in a repeat of Ferdinand Magellan's voyage around the world. The Lost Tomb. Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes to become one of the most feared leaders of the Middle Ages. He founded the largest interconnecting state in the history of the world, which he achieved by brutal conquest. In 1227, the Great Khan died. As the army was in the middle of putting down a revolt, to keep his death a secret, his heirs slaughtered anyone unfortunate enough to see Khan's funeral procession on its journey to Karakorum, the capital of the Mongol Empire. Khan asked to be buried without any markings. One legend, retold by Marco Polo, states that the 2,000 slaves who attended his funerals were slaughtered by the soldiers sent to guard them. These soldiers were in turn killed by another group who massacred anyone who crossed their path, just as a way of concealing where Genghis Khan was buried. When they reached the final destination, they took their own lives. Other legends state that a river was diverted over his body to make it impossible to find, or that trees were planted over the site. One chronicle claims his coffin was empty when it arrived in Mongolia, and another that only his shirt, tent, and boots were buried. Modern research suggests that the burial place is somewhere near the Mongol sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldan, where Khan often went to pray to the sky god Tengri. Despite expeditions to find the grave, some as recent as 2015, its location still remains unknown. The Lost Caliph. Abu Ali al-Mansur was born in Cairo in the year 375 of the Muslim calendar, or 985 AD. When he later became Imam Caliph of the Fatimid Caliphate at age 11, he was the first Fatimid ruler born in Egypt. According to the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, it was noted that al-Hakim had a, quote, eccentric character, the inconsistencies and radical shifts in his conduct and policies, the extreme austerity of his personal life, the vindictive and sanguinary ruthlessness of his dealing with the highest officials of his government, coupled with an obsession to suppress all signs of corruption and immorality in public life, his attempted annihilation of Christians and call for the systemic destruction of all Christian holy places in the Middle East, culminating in the destruction of the most holy church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, all combined to contrast his reign sharply with that of any of his predecessors and successors, and indeed of any Muslim ruler. He had extreme ideas, at one point banning women from leaving their homes and ordering the shoemakers to stop making footwear for them. He banned alcohol, chess, and even some staple Egyptian foodstuffs. But al-Hakim also founded the House of Knowledge in Cairo, and was a great patron of scientists and astronomers. According to historian Paul Walker, the Caliph was also the ideal supreme ruler, whose every action was just and righteous, and whose followers remained avidly loyal to him to the end. Because no one was sure which version of al-Hakim they were going to get, he was referred to as the Mad Caliph. His physician diagnosed him with melancholia, and if it is true that he was suffering from some form of mental illness, then this might explain his unpredictability. The 27th day of the Islamic month of Shawwal in the year 411 AH, or Monday the 13th of February 1021, had begun just like any other. Caliph al-Hakim rode out of his palace in the company of 2 grooms. They passed through the southern gates of Cairo and went off into the foothills, the Makatam Plateau to the east and the River Nile to the west. Riding out into the darkness had become quite an obsession for al-Hakim, as it was a chance for him to meditate. However, the Caliph never returned, only his horse and blood-stained garments were ever found. The man had made many enemies, and his destruction of the Holy Sepulchre was seen as a contributory factor to the start of the Crusades. His disappearance at the age of 35 remains a mystery. The Lost Origin. In the New Testament of the Bible, the Gospel of St. Matthew tells the story of Joseph of Arimathea, who wrapped the body of Jesus in a shroud and placed him in a tomb. In 1354, a shroud bearing the faint image of the front and back of a man appeared at the Church of Lury, a village in north-central France. In 1453, it was procured by the Italian royal house of Savoy, who moved it to their new capital of Turin in 1578, where it has remained ever since, stored in the Chapel of the Holy Shroud. The shroud bears the image of a gaunt man between 5'7" and 6 foot tall, with thorn marks on the head, lacerations on the back, and bruises on the shoulders. In other words, all the details align with the biblical account of Jesus suffering before and during his crucifixion. As such, the shroud is said to be his and has been venerated as such for hundreds of years. But in 1988, radiocarbon dating concluded that the fabric originated between 1260 and 1390 AD, and that the shroud was actually a medieval forgery. One expert claimed that the image and bloodstains were made from pigments readily available in the Middle Ages. However, attempts to replicate the image using techniques available from that time have always failed. In 2024, new techniques have concluded that a fragment of the cloth could be around 2,000 years old, therefore dating it to the time of Christ, believing it may have been contaminated during the Middle Ages because it was touched by countless people during religious ceremonies. Whether it is a medieval forgery or the real deal, the mystery of the Shroud of Turin continues. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and as always, I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, hope everyone has an awesome week. Cheers!